ANA eLearning Academy is brought to you by CDN Graysheet, a trusted source of rare coin and currency valuations since 1963.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the ANA eLearning Academy. The ANA would like to thank our eLearning partner, Graysheet, for the support of the eLearning program. Today, we have Franklin Noel, and he's going to be presenting on U.S. half-cents, designs, dates, and die varieties. You're going to be muted for this presentation, so if you have any questions, you may put them in the chat or Q&A box, and I will read them to the presenter at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I turn the time over for the presentation to Franklin.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here. This presentation is about the United States half cent. I bought my first half cent in 1980, and I've never looked back. In addition to being an alliterative subtitle, Designs, Dates, and Die Varieties also describes several ways to collect the U.S. half cent. Today, we'll talk about each of them. But as I go through the coin-related facts and figures, I hope also to place the half cent in its historical context by describing some important events and issues that beset the nation during the years that half cents circulated. So let's start at the beginning. The first American half cent was not struck by the United States. It was struck by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. After the 13 English colonies in America declared their independence, they operated under the loose association created by the Articles of Confederation, under which each state retained the authority to strike its own coins, provided they conformed to the national standard established by the Continental Congress. While some other states issued some non-denominational coppers, only Massachusetts established a mint and for 2 years struck half cents and cents to the national standard. In 1788, the people of the United States scrapped the Articles of Confederation and adopted a new constitution that expressly prohibited the states from striking coins and lodged the power to coin money exclusively in the new Congress the Constitution created. In 1792, the new Congress established the mint, and in 1793, the mint, located in Philadelphia, under the direction of David Rittenhouse, began the striking of cents and half cents for circulation. The first U.S. half cent design has the bust of Liberty facing left. All the 1793 half cents were struck between July 19th and July 25th, 1793. We know this because research done by Bill Eckberg found records showing the days on which half cents were struck and the number delivered to the mint's treasurer. Eckberg concluded that each of the 4 die varieties for 1793 half cents were struck on a different day. 2 obverse dies and 3 reverse dies created 4 die varieties for 1793. If Eckberg's analysis is correct, this half cent that you're looking at now was struck on July 24th, 1793. It is a C3 die variety, according to the taxonomy established by half-cent expert Roger Cohen in his book, The Little Half-Sisters. At the time, there was no chief engraver at the mint, or any engraver for that matter. So who designed the first U.S. half-cent type? There are several contenders, but the evidence strongly supports those who say it was in fact the chief coiner, Henry Voigt. The chief coiner was more than the coin press operator. He was more like a general manager. And in 1795, a report was written about getting the mint up and running. The mint director reported, quote, It was a considerable time before an engraver could be engaged, during which the chief coiner was obligated to make the dies for himself. No sooner had the half-cents been struck and delivered than disaster struck the city of Philadelphia. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia physician, recognized these 4 symptoms in several patients he treated in August of 1793. He recalled that yellow fever had previously ravaged Philadelphia in 1762, and after consulting with colleagues, they concluded that the yellow fever had returned with a vengeance. By August 28th, one Philadelphia newspaper reported that a malignant and contagious fever now prevails. Anyone who could afford to left the city. Many of those left behind got sick and died. Roughly 10% of Philadelphia's population died from yellow fever in 1793, including Joseph Wright, who, but for his untimely death, would likely have become the first chief engraver of the fledgling U.S. Mint. Other things occurring in 1793 included the passage of the first fugitive slave law. In February 1793, Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act. The act required even free states to return fugitive slaves to their owners in the slave states from which they may have escaped. Lax enforcement in free states fueled the tension between North and South in the years before the Civil War. In September 1793, President Washington laid the cornerstone for the new United States Capitol building, beginning a construction project that has been ongoing ever since. In the years before the Civil War, much of the labor was supplied by enslaved workers. Famously, as a symbol that the Union would endure, President Lincoln ordered that work on the iconic Capitol dome continue throughout the Civil War. The dome slowly took shape and was finally completed in 1869. In October of 1793, Eli Whitney, seen here on the right, applied for a patent on his invention that automated the removal of green seeds from cotton bolls, making large-scale cotton cultivation using slave labor economical, dramatically altering the slave-driven economy of the southern states. By the end of 1793, the Mint had its first duly appointed chief engraver, Robert Scott, who would serve for nearly 30 years. Scott redesigned the Liberty Cap half-cent, in part by having Liberty face right instead of left, creating the second of the 5 major design types for U.S. half-cents. 5 obverse dies and 5 reverse dies were mixed and matched to create 9 different die varieties of 1794 half-cents, the most die varieties for any Liberty Cap half-cent, and the second most die varieties among all of the half-cent years. We won't go through the diagnostics of all 9 of the 1794 die varieties, so let's just say some are more common than others. If you are working on a typeset or a date set of US half-cents, you shouldn't have much difficulty in locating an affordable 1794 specimen with nice eye appeal. This is a fairly common 1794 C2. Scott's decision to turn Liberty around had the effect of making the 1793, seen here on the left again, a single-year type, which increases the demand for it from type collectors who need one to complete their typesets. This increased demand, together with the limited supply, fewer than 32,000 were struck, puts pressure on the price, making 1793 one of the more expensive dates to acquire. Some contend that 1794 was also a single-year type coin, though many lump the 1794s with the other right-facing liberties, 1795, 1796, and 1797. This is the 1795 Liberty Cap half cent facing right. As you can see, Scott has reduced the size and flattened the relief of Liberty's head, but he retained the same basic design of Liberty with her cap facing right. 2 obverse and 4 reverse dies generated 6 1795 die varieties. Again, I don't plan to describe how to identify all 6 die varieties. Instead, let me just show you some select examples and tell you something about how they came to be. Die varieties are identifiable from the elements that were punched into individual dies, as opposed to those elements that came from a hub and are therefore common to all of the working dies for a given date. Some 1795 half cents come with the letter I in place of the numeral 1 in the date. The date was individually punched into the 1795 dies and was not part of the hub. Perhaps the die sinker couldn't find a numeral 1, so he just reached for the letter I, which looks enough like a 1 to serve as 1. Some 1795 half cents come with what's called a punctuated date. It's just a mistake, a defect in the die right here between the 1 and the 7 that looks like a comma between the 2 digits of the date. Some come with a lettered edge, and some come with a plain edge. Some come with a pole for the Liberty Cap, and some come without the pole. Obviously, the pole was a feature that was individually punched into the individual dies, and for the dies that don't have a pole, the die sinker just forgot to put it there. The same is true for 1796 half cents. Indeed, for 1796 half cents, the presence or absence of a pole is the main feature that distinguishes the 2 known die varieties of 1796. They both share a common reverse. 1796 is a tough year for both the with pole and the without pole varieties. For those working on a date set, this is likely to be the toughest date to fill. Any 1796 half cent will likely run well into the 5 figures. Another blunder helps define the varieties for 1797. There are 3. This is what's called the 1/1 variety. Here you can see that the engraver started to punch the date way too high, and had he continued, that final 7 would have run right into Liberty's neck. So it appears he began the date all over, punching the 1 beneath the first 1, and then completing the date with plenty of room to spare. But you can still see that first 1, so this is called the 1/1 die variety. There's also a normal head and what's called a low head. This is the low head. You can see it's pretty self-evident why it's called the low head. In addition to being a bit more scarce than the first 2 die marriages, the low head variety also poses a edge subvariety challenge. While the first 2 1797 die marriages only come with plain edges, the edge of the C3 low head comes in 3 flavors: plain, lettered, and gripped. Both lettered edge and gripped edge are rare subvarieties. So what are subvarieties? One feature of the Liberty Cap half cent that does not plague other half cents is the presence or absence of edge lettering and the differences between the size of the letters. That's right, differences in the edge lettering on some Liberty Cap half cents create additional and sometimes quite rare, and in one case, unique subvarieties. All of these subvarieties can become quite problematic for those collectors attempting to assemble a 99 coin complete set of circulation strike die varieties. I'm not going to go through them all, but this slide describes all the different subvarieties that exist for the different dates in the 1790s. So to review, the first US half cents all feature the bust of Liberty with a Liberty cap. The 1793s have Liberty facing left and come in 4 different die varieties. In the 4 years between 1794, the right-facing Liberties come in 20 different obverse, reverse. In all, when the 11 subvarieties are added, the mint struck a total of 31 different right-facing Liberty Cap die varieties. No half cents were struck in 1798 or 1799. In 1800, the half cent took on a whole new look. Before we see what changes were wrought, let's do a bit more context setting. The election of 1800 remains one of the most contentious in American history, though 2020 has certainly given it a run for the money. As the election unfolded, it posed a challenge to the Constitution that could only be remedied by an amendment. The election ostensibly pitted President John Adams from Massachusetts against the Virginian Thomas Jefferson, the then sitting vice president. The Constitution, as originally adopted, called for each elector in the Electoral College to cast 2 votes, without designating which was for president and which was for vice president. The top vote getter would become the president, and the runner-up would become the vice president. That's how John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were elected in 1796. The founders had not accounted for the rise of political parties. By 1800, parties had taken on an important role in elections, and candidates for president had started taking on running mates for vice president. Jefferson and Aaron Burr ran on a ticket as Republicans, and Adams and Charles Pinckney represented the Federalists. As it happened, the race turned out to be between Thomas Jefferson and his own running mate, Aaron Burr. It was a tie. As the presidential electors did not identify which of their 2 votes was for president and which was for vice president, the Republican electors ended up casting half their votes for Jefferson and half for Burr, resulting in a tie between Jefferson and his own running mate. Under those circumstances, the Constitution called for the House of Representatives to break the tie by voting by state, 1 vote per state. But on the first ballot in the House of Representatives, each candidate again received the same number of votes. After 36 ballots in the House of Representatives, Jefferson was eventually elected president and Aaron Burr vice president. To prevent a recurrence of the unintended tie between running mates, the 12th Amendment was adopted to the Constitution to mandate that when each elector casts their 2 ballots in the Electoral College, they designate which is for president and which is for vice president. Earlier this year, on January 6th to be precise, we had an opportunity to see on national television how the counting of electoral votes is conducted. The eagle-eyed art historians among us may have noticed that each of the portraits I have included of Adams, Jefferson, and Burr were all painted by, or at least attributed to, famed American portrait painter Gilbert Stuart, which provides a perfect segue to talk about the change in the 1800 to the draped bust half-cent. Numismatic folklore maintains that Gilbert Stuart designed the portrait of liberty that appears on the draped bust coinage, and that for his model he chose vivacious Philadelphia socialite Anne Willing Bingham. The draped bust profile of liberty had first appeared 5 years earlier on the 1795 dollar. Decades later, in 1861, the then mint director, James Ross Snowden, wrote, "The head of liberty on the dollar of 1795 was designed by Stuart, the celebrated portrait painter, at the request of the director, as we learn from a relation of the family. Stuart facetiously remarking that liberty on the other coins had run mad, referring to the disheveled hair on the previous coins. We will bind it up and thus render her a steady matron." Serious numismatic researchers have searched in vain for any confirmation that Gilbert Stuart actually had a hand in designing the draped bust coinage. No Stuart biographer mentions it, and his surviving artwork, which is plentiful and which has been extensively documented, contains no sketches or drawings of any coin-related images. While Snowden's statement that Gilbert Stuart designed the draped bust coinage is at best unconfirmed, the contention that Philadelphia socialite Anne Bingham was Stuart's model is just rank speculation. I trace this unsubstantiated claim to Don Taxay's 1966 book, The U.S. Mint and Coinage, where he writes, quote, "A single portrait among his collected works, that of Mrs. William Bingham, seen here in the portrait referenced by Taxay, bears a close resemblance. That, together with a footnote mentioning that Mrs. Bingham was a friend of both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and, quote, was considered the most beautiful, charming, and intelligent woman in Philadelphia, end quote, is the sum total of the evidence that Anne Bingham was Stuart's model for the draped bust coinage. Yet from these two sources, written more than 100 years apart, has sprung the accepted wisdom that Anne Bingham was Gilbert Stuart's model for liberty on the draped bust coinage. While likely not true, the claim does provide an opportunity for an entertaining romp through early American art history. So now let's move on to the draped bust half-cents. Draped bust liberty, as mentioned, first appeared on the dollar coin in 1795. In 1800, Robert Scott put her on the half-cent. She remained there through 1808. In some years, there were several interesting and a few very rare die varieties. 1800 was not one of those years. All 1800 half-cents were struck from the same pair of dies. These are them. The single 1800 die variety is quite common and affordable across the grades. No half-cents were struck in 1801. 1802, on the other hand, gives us one of the first true rarities of the half-cents. This is the 1802 C1, sometimes called the reverse of 1800, because the reverse die was actually the same die used to strike the reverse of the 1800 half cent. Although quite rare, with only about 35 known specimens, 2 of them sold just last month at Heritage's Portrait Collection sale. One, graded NGC Details, fine, sold for just over $10,000. And the other, graded NGC 30, sold for more than $110,000. Most 1802 C1s are low grade, and some, like this one, are just ungradable. There's one other 1802 die variety. It too is scarce, but not as rare as the C1. In 1803, the mint struck 4 half-cent varieties by mixing and matching 2 obverse and 4 reverse dies. None are rare, though the C2 is somewhat scarce. This is the more common C1 variety. (1804) gives us the most die varieties of any half-cent year. There are a total of 12, though Roger Cohen's numbering system goes through C13. C3 is no longer considered a variety. More about that in a moment. Of the 12 1804 die varieties, only one is rare, the C2, and some others are scarce. This is the rather common 1804 C1. The obverse die shows up again as the spiked chin, and this reverse die, known as the cross-eyed zeros because of the closeness of the 2 zeros in the 1/200 fraction, shows up again on the rare C2 1804 die variety. This is that rare C2. Indeed, this is the first C2 variety discovered in 1967 by Howard Hazelcorn. When Roger Cohen first wrote his half-cent book, The Little Half-Sisters, only 2 specimens were known. He used this specimen to illustrate the variety. Since then, more have been discovered, but they are nearly all low grade. Maybe 30 are known today. Let's talk now about the spiked chin variety. To be precise, 4 separate die varieties sport the spiked chin. All 4 share the same obverse die, which is paired with 4 different reverse dies. The common obverse die is actually the same obverse die that was used to strike the C1 variety with which we started our discussion of 1804, seen again here on the left. Between the time it was used to strike the C1 variety and when it appears on the 4 spiked chin die varieties, the die incurred significant damage, producing the 3 diagnostic features of the spiked chin obverse. The first, of course, is the spike itself, which we can see here protruding from Liberty's chin. Second, there is a small, almost imperceptible die defect between Liberty's lips right here, which does not appear on the unblemished C1 die. And third, there are these concentric arcs that show up right in front of Liberty's throat, which don't exist on the unblemished C1 die. Much ink has been spilled trying to explain what caused the damage which makes the spiked chin the spiked chin. The short answer is we don't really know, but we do have a fairly good idea of when it occurred. We know this because of what is sometimes called the spikeless chin. In addition to the cross-eyed zero reverse of the C1 variety with which we started, This unblemished obverse from C1 was also paired with one other reverse die before the spiked chin damage occurred. That is the reverse, sometimes called the equidistant 1, referring to the placement of the 1 in the numerator of the fraction 1/200th. The 1 is equidistant between the fraction bar and the ribbon immediately above it. As the equidistant 1 reverse is known to be paired with both the spiked chin obverse and the same obverse before any damage occurred, we can infer that the spiked chin damage to the obverse happened while this C1 obverse was in the press, paired with the equidistant 1 reverse. Cohen had called the pairing of this equidistant 1 reverse with the spiked chin obverse C5. In the first edition of his half-cent book, Cohen had called this die marriage of the equidistant 1 reverse with the unblemished obverse C3. But as the obverse and reverse of the C5, in the second edition of his book, Cohen delisted the C3, recognizing that the spiked chin damage to the obverse simply makes the C3 an earlier die state of the C5. The C5 die state without the spiked chin damage is rare and is still sought by some serious half-cent collectors, but it is no longer considered a separate die variety. In any event, after the pairing of the damaged spiked chin obverse with the equidistant reverse, it was paired with 3 other reverse dies. Of the 4 spiked chin die varieties, 2 are scarce and 2 are quite plentiful. A pleasing spiked chin half-cent with good eye appeal should be readily available in any grade. I could spend the entire hour just talking about the spiked chin and the other 1804 die varieties, so I feel compelled to move on to 1805. There are 4 varieties of 1805, one of which is rare, one of which is scarce, and 2 that are common. This is the rare 1805 C2. Notice how small the 5 is in the date. Serendipitously, there are also 4 varieties of 1806, one of which is rare, one of which is scarce, and 2 of which are common. This is the very common C1 variety. There's only one variety for 1807, and it is very common. 1808 is the last year of the draped bust half-cents. There are 3 die varieties. The C1 is the rarest of all half-cent die varieties, and the C3 is the most creative. This is the very rare C1. The obverse has an 8 punched over a 7, giving the 8 kind of a flat top look. The reverse die failed almost immediately upon use. You can see here the reverse die and the obverse die were not well aligned, causing the upper left of the reverse to be struck up fairly sharply, while the lower right is barely there. The added pressure at the upper left caused this die crack to occur almost immediately. You can see it coming from the rim and across the letters of the word states. The die crack likely caused the die to fail altogether, and it was immediately removed from service, accounting for the very few C1 specimens that exist. It was replaced by a different reverse die, which was used together with the same obverse to strike a larger number of the C2 variety. Eventually, the obverse failed as well, and a new reverse continued to be used with a second obverse die to strike the C3 variety. To distinguish it from the overdate used on C1 and C2, the C3 is called a normal date. But does this date look normal to you? When the new obverse die was pressed into service, it had the 180 already punched into the die. And when the die sinker went to add the final 8, he apparently could not locate a numeral 8 punch. So he took the 0 punch that's used to make the 2 zeros in the 1/200th fraction on the reverse and punched one over the other to make this rather large 8 in the final digit of the date. Both the new reverse and the new obverse lasted for quite some time, as this C3 normal date variety is very plentiful. The draped bust half cent is my personal favorite design type. If you're keeping score, half cents were struck in 1800, the last year of the Adams administration, and in every other year of the Jefferson administration, 1802 through 1808. No half cents were struck in 1801. For those 8 years, half cents come in 31 different die varieties. Before we move on to the next major design type, let's take a minute to set some context for the new classic head half cent that came out in the first year of the Madison administration. In 1809, James Madison, on the left in another Gilbert Stuart portrait, became the nation's 4th president, the 3rd to come from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the 3rd to be a slave owner. He lived a short distance down the road from Jefferson's Monticello on a plantation called Montpelier, seen here on the right in an 1818 watercolor by the wife of the then French ambassador to the United States. Montpelier is today owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Montpelier has embarked on a daunting undertaking it calls the Naming Project. Slavery was not just a political issue. It was also a moral issue and eventually became a legal issue. Most importantly, it was a personal issue. The Naming Project aims to comb through all the documentary evidence that mentions by name any of the enslaved people at Montpelier and to reconstruct what is known about the lives of each of them. Information about the project can be found on Montpelier's website, here at the bottom of the slide, and in its Instagram account. For example, a good deal is known about a woman named Harriet, who was born at Montpelier in 1809, the same year James Madison became president, and the same year the classic head half cents were introduced. She grew up to become a skilled weaver. In 1844, Dolly Madison, who had a son by her first husband, not James, deeded Harriet together with a number of other enslaved people to her son, John Payne Todd. John Todd sold Harriet to a Mr. Carpenter on Christmas Eve, 1845. This is an 1809 classic head half cent. The same design had appeared on the large cent a year earlier. Based in part on the writings of Walter Breen, generations of numismatists have believed that the classic head half cent was designed by John Reich, an assistant engraver hired by the Mint in 1807. Bill Eckberg argues somewhat persuasively that it is unlikely that Reich was responsible for the design and suggests that Robert Scott designed it. For 1809, there are 6 die varieties. This is the popular circle in O variety. If you look carefully at the 0 in the date, you can see it was repunched. So there appears to be another circle inside the 0 of the 1809 date. Half-cent collectors also call this the C4 variety. In addition to the repunched 0, the variety is distinguished, like all 1809 half-cents, by the location of the tip of the highest leaf in the wreath on the reverse. On the C4, you can see it reaches almost all the way over to the letter O in the word of. If you find an 1809 half-cent where this high leaf does not extend past the end of the second letter S in the word states, you have found the scarce C1 variety. There are 4 other die varieties for a total of 6. None other than this C1 is scarce or rare. There's only one die variety for 1810. For 1811, there are 2. This is the wide date, referring to the space between the 1 and the 8. This is the narrow date. You can see they're closer together. Both are scarce, the C1 more so. But after the 1811 half-cents were delivered, half-cent production took a holiday for nearly 15 years. No half-cents were struck between 1811 and 1825. Historians sometimes call those years the era of good feelings. However, during this same time, the sectionalism that would come to define the first half of the 19th century had begun to solidify. By 1820, there were an equal number of states where slavery had been abolished and states where slavery was quickly becoming a mainstay of the region's economy, thanks in part to Eli Whitney's cotton gin. When Missouri, the first state to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, sought admission to the Union as a slave state, sectional political positions hardened. To maintain the sectional balance of power between slave and free states, Senator Henry Clay brokered a compromise that would allow Missouri to be admitted as a slave state, while Maine, which had always been a separate district of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state. Slavery would be banned north of the 36-degree 30-minute parallel in the Louisiana Territory, but permitted in that territory below that latitude. This compromise, the first of many that would earn Henry Clay the nickname the Great Compromiser, allowed the Union to postpone answering the question of how slavery could exist in a nation whose founding document declared the self-evident truth that all men were created equal. Indeed, in writing to a congressman from Massachusetts in April 1820 about what would come to be called the Missouri Compromise, the author of that declaration wrote, quote, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." Although by 1820, Thomas Jefferson had come to favor the expansion of slavery into the territories, 40 years earlier, in describing the same dilemma, Jefferson had written, quote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest." For nearly a decade and a half, the nation's economy got along well without the need to strike any new half-cents. demonstrating that the half cent was already becoming a coin in search of a purpose. Half cent production resumed in 1825. The two varieties for 1825 share a common reverse, but the two obverses are distinguished by the placement of the date in respect of this lowest curl on Liberty's hair. On this C1, you can see it's right above the 5, and on the C2, that curl falls between the 2 and the 5. The C1 is somewhat scarce, while the C2 is plentiful. There are also two varieties for 1826. This is the C1, and that's the C2. The C2 is quite plentiful. I'm sorry, the C2 is quite scarce, while the C1 is plentiful. There are three varieties for 1828. Each was struck from a different pair of dies. The C1 has the traditional 13 stars on the obverse. The C2 has only 12. Maybe the die sinker was drunk that day. The C3, like the C1, has 13 stars. All three varieties are readily available at affordable prices. 1829 is represented by a single variety, which is readily available and affordable. No half cents were struck for circulation in 1830, and most numismatists agree that all extant half cents dated 1831 are in fact circulated proofs. 1832 gave us three varieties. All three share a single obverse, and the varieties are defined by subtle differences in the three reverses. All three are plentiful in most grades. 1833 is another single variety year and is plentiful and affordable. So too is 1834. 1835 gives us two varieties, both of which are common. Two reverse dies are each paired with the same obverse die. That's the C1, and this is the C2. And that wraps up the classic heads. For those of you that are still keeping score, the classic head half cents were struck in 11 of the years between 1809 and 1835. Classic head half cents come in 24 different die varieties. From 1836 to 1849, no half cents were struck for circulation. Some proofs were struck, but they are beyond the scope of this presentation. So let's talk for a minute about another woman named Harriet. This is Harriet Tubman. Until the 13th Amendment at the conclusion of the Civil War, slavery continued to dominate political debate throughout the nation. As I said earlier, slavery was not just a political, moral, and legal issue. It was also personal. For Harriet Tubman, it was very personal. In 1849, she escaped from slavery. Over the next several years, using a network of safe houses, she and others established underground railroad routes that she used to lead 70 other slaves, many of them family and friends, to freedom. Harriet Tubman herself has two numismatic connections. First, a capped bust $50 found recently in the ground on the eastern shore of Maryland allowed archaeologists to locate more precisely the site of the place where she likely grew up. Secondly, she is slated to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill, though now not likely until 2030. In 1849, the year Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery, half-cent production for circulation resumed. The braided hair Liberty that chief engraver Christian Gobrecht had earlier designed for large cents and for proof half cents appeared on the circulation strike half cents beginning in 1849. With the exception of 1852, Circulation strike half-cent production continued every year until the half-cent was discontinued in 1857. Die production had become more mechanized and mintages were fairly small. There is only one die variety for each of the 8 years the braided hair Liberty adorned the half-cent. Except for the date, they all look exactly alike. This is the 1849, 1850, 51, 53, there were no 52s, 54, 55, 56, 57. By 1857, the half-cent had long outlived its usefulness, as had the large cent. The coins, which contained roughly their face value in copper, had become too unwieldy for everyday transactions. In 1857, Congress eliminated the half-cent altogether. The cent would be reduced in size and weight. The cent became a fiat coin, worth a cent only because Congress said it was, not because it contained a cent's worth of copper. This elimination of the large cent and half cent inspired many to begin saving the old coins and is often cited as the impetus for establishing the hobby of coin collecting in the United States. 1857 was a pivotal year not only in the history of numismatics, but also in the history of the nation. In March 1857, the Supreme Court decided Dred Scott versus Sandford, a case that many thought would decide for all time the legal questions surrounding the issue of slavery. Some, including newly elected President Buchanan, hoped the Supreme Court's opinion in Dred Scott would put an end to the sectional conflict over slavery. Among other things, Dred Scott argued that he had been made free by his prolonged residence at Fort Snelling in the territory made free by the Missouri Compromise. Instead, the Supreme Court held in a sweeping opinion by Chief Justice Roger Taney that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional when it purported to prohibit slavery in the northern Louisiana Territory. Because the decision was such a resounding victory for the pro-slavery partisans and had the capacity to nationalize slavery and to eliminate the power of individual states to abolish it, Abraham Lincoln made it a major issue in his campaign for the presidency in 1860. The sectional conflict over slavery would likely have led to civil war under any circumstances, but as there was no further legal recourse available, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision assured that only armed conflict could resolve the question of whether slavery could continue to exist in a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Finally, for the scorekeepers among us, let's review. With only 5 coins, maybe 6 if you think 1794 is a distinct design types. Only the 1793 Liberty facing left will be a challenge. Half cents were struck in only half of the 64 years between 1793 and 1857. So one can complete a date set of US half cents with 32 coins. Only the 1793, 1796, perhaps 1802 will prove problematic. Die variety collectors will need 88 coins to complete a set limited to obverse-reverse die marriages, that is, excluding all the subvarieties. Several die marriages are difficult, but not impossible to acquire. For the truly dedicated die variety collectors who want a collection that includes all subvarieties, that is a task that can be completed by only 1 half-cent collector at a time. It requires 99 coins, including the 1794 C6 with large edge letters, of which only 1 is known. Let me conclude by saying that I have over 10 different half-cent books. My 2 favorites are Roger Cohen's, which he calls The Little Half-Sisters, and Bill Eckberg's, which he calls The Story of America's Greatest Little Coin. If you buy only 1 half-cent book, I recommend Bill's. It is comprehensive and chock full of innovative insights about America's greatest little coin. And with that, I believe I've run out of time, and there may be just a few minutes left for questions. So here we go.
Yes, Franklin, if you would unshare your screen, please. And then if anybody has any questions at this point, I would ask that you please put it in the Q&A and or the chat box, and I can read out loud to Franklin for him to be able to answer those questions. I actually was curious. I don't know if you already said this. Forgive me if you have, Franklin, but are you trying to pursue a complete set of the 99?
No, I'm going to be satisfied with the 88. So there are 88 obverse reverse die marriages, and that's all I'm going to aspire to. The edge lettering die varieties are, most of the ones that are rare are really rare.
Right.
And as I said, there is one that is itself unique. It's only one, and I'm never going to be that collector.
That is amazing. We do have a question from Matthew Schaefer. Franklin, he asks, how did you first develop an interest in half cents?
Good question. When I first sort of was reintroduced to coin collecting in my late 20s, I was drawn to the early American coppers. I thought they had the most interesting newsletter, the most interesting research being done. And almost everybody in that group was looking for large cents. And I didn't want to compete with all of them. There seemed to be a much smaller group collecting the half cents. And I thought the half cents were just a much more interesting and challenging set to follow.
Sure. Open to anyone else for questions at this time. I don't have any in the Q&A, and I believe you can see the chat bar as well.
I'm going to say the chats pop up one at a time. Here we go. Yes. Okay. So one of them says the 1808/7 C1 looks familiar. So one of the things that the early American coppers does every year at their convention is they have what's called a half cent happening. Well, we haven't had a convention for the last 2 years because of the COVID crisis, but we've had the half cent happening just like this online via Zoom. And Tim Skinsky, who just posted that it looks familiar, I showed this particular coin at the half cent happening back a few months ago when we had the virtual half cent happening.
Are there any other questions at this point for Franklin?
Well, we seem to have filled up most of the time, so I'm going to thank you very much for having me and allowing me to present. It's a fascinating topic. Half cents, I think, are just a great thing to collect. And I'd urge anybody who's got any interest in early American history and or coins or both, the half cents are a great way to pursue it.
Absolutely. I've been collecting for quite a long time, but I would consider myself still kind of a baby collector. But there were many coins in this presentation that I've never seen before. And so I would like to, in a kind of a closing, just thank you, Franklin, for such a wonderful and educational presentation today. And I hope everyone enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. And again, we would like to thank Graysheet for their partnership with the ANA eLearning Academy. We hope that you guys will enjoy us for future webinars, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.